Hello. Welcome to today's webinar on positive discipline in healthy kids, brought to you by the Center for the Improvement of Student Learning at OSPI, the Association of Washington School Principals, Education Services District 112, and Change Lab Solutions. To put a face to the names and voices you'll hear from today, my name is Cesar De La Vega, and I am a policy analyst at Change Lab Solutions.
And I'm Alexis Eto, a senior attorney at Change Lab.
We're thrilled to have with us today from the Association of Washington School Principals, Kurt Hatch. You'll hear more from him shortly. This is a rich topic area, and we have lots to pack into this one-hour session, so let's dive right in.
For folks not familiar with Change Lab Solutions, we work across the nation to advance equitable laws and policies that ensure healthy lives for all. We prioritize communities whose residents are at highest risk for poor health. Our interdisciplinary team of lawyers, planners, policy analysts, and more work with neighborhoods, cities, tribal communities, and states to create thriving communities where everyone, no matter where they are or where they live, can lead a healthy life. We achieve our mission by working with a wide range of partners. Today's webinar is being supported by a grant we have from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which allows us to provide technical assistance and trainings to communities across the country. I'm going to make just a quick disclaimer that Change Lab does not enter into attorney-client relationships. The information provided in today's webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice.
Here's a roadmap for our time together. We'll begin by answering a fundamental question. Why do school discipline practices matter? To do that, we'll explore the connections between adverse childhood experiences, trauma, and school discipline practices. Next, we will look at promising alternatives for creating safe and supportive school environments, including restorative justice practices, social and emotional learning, and positive behavioral interventions and supports, where we'll be joined by Kurt Hatch to learn more. Then we'll provide a brief overview of Washington's new discipline policies that promote positive and restorative approaches and connect it to reforms taking place in other states and at the national level. After that, we'll spend some time discussing how to respond to common concerns from parents and other stakeholders about the move away from punitive school discipline practices. Finally, we'll close with a brief Q&A session. We encourage you at any point to share your questions via the chat box function. Returning to this first question of why school discipline practices matter, it's important to do some context setting. And for that, we'll begin by talking about the impacts of childhood adversity and toxic stress on children's health and academic trajectories. Growing up, all children are confronted with stressors of varying intensities, whether it's feeling nervous before performing in front of the entire school or something much more consequential, like facing emotional neglect at home. While some stress can be positive and what researchers consider a normal and essential part of healthy development, more serious adversities like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, or violence can lead to toxic stress. Let's take a look at some of these more serious adversities. The Center for Youth Wellness defines adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short, as traumatic experiences that can have a profound effect on a child's developing brain and body, with lasting impacts on a person's health throughout her lifespan. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of ACEs, but what isn't always as well known is just how common ACEs are. So let's look at the data. Nearly half, 45% of all children in the U.S. have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. Further, children of certain races and ethnicities face a greater risk of experiencing ACEs. According to national data, a greater percentage of Black non-Hispanic children, 61%, and Hispanic children, 51%, have experienced at least one ACE compared to their Asian non-Hispanic and white non-Hispanic peers. When we consider this data alongside national data on disparities in school discipline practices, we see that the same children who experience higher rates of adversity and trauma outside of the classroom are more likely to face severe and more frequent punishment in schools via exclusionary discipline policies and practices, which can include in and out of school suspensions, expulsions, referrals to law enforcement, and even corporal punishment. Keep this intersection of ACEs and school discipline disparities top of mind, as we'll come back to it in a few minutes. Coming back to the national data on ACEs, Black non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic children of other races are also more likely than white children to experience 2 or more ACEs. This is critical to note because research has found that children who have experienced multiple ACEs are substantially more likely to be negatively affected than children who have experienced only one ACE. Let's turn our attention now to ACEs data in Washington. 47% of children aged 0 to 17 in Washington have experienced at least one ACE. This isn't far off from the national percentage of 45%. The most common ACEs children in Washington experience are economic hardship, divorce, alcohol misuse or mental illness in the household, and violence in the home or neighborhood environment. Also troubling, 11% of Washington children have had 3 or more ACEs. Again, remember that these children are substantially more likely to be negatively affected than children who have experienced only one ACE. What are some of those effects? Let's discuss. In the absence of protective factors, like support from a caring parent or other adult, a child exposed to repeated and or prolonged adversity may develop a toxic stress response that interrupts healthy brain development. The effects of this toxic stress response are especially pronounced during early childhood, when brain development is most sensitive to external factors. This toxic stress response to ACEs increases a person's risk for lower educational achievement, social and economic stability, chronic disease, and lower life expectancy. Let's discuss some specific examples. We'll start with a student's academic trajectory. ACEs are associated with chronic absenteeism, a more accurate predictor of school dropout than standardized test scores or low grades. Children exposed to ACEs are also more likely to have behavioral and learning challenges and struggle in schools. How about socioeconomic outcomes over the course of one's lifetime? Well, according to a 2016 multi-state study of adults, individuals reporting 4 or more ACEs were more likely to report high school non-completion and household poverty, and those with 3 or more ACEs were more likely to report periods of unemployment. For a final example, let's consider health. There is a strong dose-response relationship between ACEs and various behavioral issues, including risk of suicide attempts, sexual risk behaviors, and lifetime depressive episodes, meaning that as exposure to ACEs increases, so does the risk of these behavioral issues. The toxic stress response to ACEs also affects biological systems, including potential disruptions of the metabolic and immune systems, which may result in a greater likelihood of becoming physically ill over one's lifetime. And finally, lower life expectancy. People who experience 6 or more ACEs on average died nearly 20 years earlier than those who experienced 0 ACEs. Now, I understand those are some harrowing statistics, but there is hope, found among other places, in the ability to mitigate or lessen the effects of ACEs and toxic stress. One way to achieve this is by building resilience through protective factors that act like a shield to buffer or safeguard children from the harms of ACEs and toxic stress. Specific examples include 1, providing children with nurturing and supportive relationships with adults, whether parents, caregivers, or other adults children may frequently encounter, and 2, by strengthening key social and emotional skills. More on that shortly. Next, I'd like for us to continue to connect the dots, and we'll start by asking the question, what role can schools play here? Well, as places where children spend the majority of their formative years, schools have the potential to play a critical role in mitigating the effects that ACEs and toxic stress can have on a young person's healthy development and educational success. We all know, for example, that early childhood education is critical to building the foundation for a person's health and well-being. Schools are also a natural setting to provide youth with protective factors, for example, by ensuring nurturing relationships with adults in the school setting.
However, many schools, beginning as early as preschool, continue to suspend and expel students, particularly students of color, LGBTQ youth, and students with disabilities at alarming rates. Black preschoolers, for example, are 3.6 times more likely to receive 1 or more out-of-school suspensions than their white peers, often for the same developmentally appropriate behaviors. Unfortunately, the disparities that emerge when children are 3 and 4 years old do not stop when they leave preschool. Those stark differences persist into kindergarten and through 12th grade. For example, in Washington State, Black students are disciplined at higher rates, almost 2.5 times more frequently than their white peers. American Indian and Native Alaskan students are also disciplined at disproportionate rates, more than 2 times more so than white students. Students who identify as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, as well as multiracial, are also overrepresented in the discipline rate. This is a missed opportunity for schools. Rather than developing multi-tiered systems of support or positive approaches that teach children critical social and emotional skills, many schools implement policies that deliver harsh, predetermined punishments. This results in negative outcomes for children's learning and health, especially for those children who are already more susceptible to experiencing higher rates of trauma and childhood adversity outside of schools. I want to spend a few minutes just unpacking 3 of those negative outcomes here. So first, traditional forms of punishment can negatively affect how a child does in school. Studies show that exclusionary discipline is associated with chronic absenteeism, decreased academic engagement, and lower academic performance. This can increase students' risk of dropout and coming into contact with the juvenile and criminal justice system, fueling what is referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline, and widening the racial achievement and wealth gaps in this country. Second, traditional forms of punishment don't just affect the child being disciplined. They can negatively affect the rest of the students in the class. One argument that we hear often in favor of exclusionary discipline practices is that they're needed to control classroom behavior and to keep students and teachers safe. However, multiple studies have found that suspensions early in the school year were not an effective deterrent to behavioral issues later in the year, nor did they create safer environments for students and staff. We'll talk more on that later. Instead, traditional forms of punishment can create feelings of mistrust between students and teachers, and they've also been linked to social isolation of students and lower levels of connectivity between students and schools. Finally, when we push children out of classrooms, we are depriving them of their education, which is a key social determinant of health. Social determinants of health are the conditions in which people live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of health risks and outcomes. What this means is that individuals with less education are more likely to live in low-income neighborhoods with higher crime rates, less access to healthy foods and green space, poorly resourced schools, fewer job opportunities, greater exposure to environmental toxins, among a myriad of other factors that increase one's risk of chronic disease and in some cases even lowers life expectancy. In addition, they fail to address the root causes of behavior. As Cesar mentioned, childhood is an important time for the developing brain. Exposure to early and repeated adversity can literally change a child's brain, including areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making, and self-regulatory skills, or the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain. So there are neurobiological reasons for children's behavior, which can help explain why some children are more likely to engage in violent or risky behavior. When we kick kids out of school for acting out or for smoking or vaping, for example, without supportive interventions, we're not addressing the root causes of that behavior. What is far more powerful, and what the science makes very clear, is that safe, caring relationships are crucial to supporting children's healthy development and building resiliency. Students who feel connected to their school are more likely to succeed academically, have better attendance, and engage in healthy behaviors. That's because school connectedness is another one of those critical protective factors that Cesar described earlier. And this one specifically has been found to help protect against things like anxiety, depression, riskier violent behavior, and suicidal ideation and attempts among youth. So how does this all fit together? Let's circle back to a point that we made earlier, which is that the same children who experience higher rates of adversity and trauma outside of the classroom are disproportionately subjected to harsh discipline practices in schools. The emerging science demonstrating the connections between childhood adversity and school discipline practices highlights the need to rethink the way we respond to students' behaviors. Otherwise, we run the risk of perpetuating a harmful cycle where the students who would most benefit from a positive school environment instead experience a whole host of negative socioeconomic and health outcomes that can follow them through the course of their lives and their children's lives. The good news, though, is that there are resources and evidence-based strategies that schools can use to disrupt that cycle and serve as stabilizing forces in the lives of young people.
As an increasing number of schools transition away from punitive discipline practices, we are better positioned to identify and evaluate promising alternatives that not only remove the harmful discipline practices, but also replace them with supportive interventions. We're also fortunate to have at our fingertips advances in science that can inform this identification process to highlight those alternatives that support both educational success and healthy development. Let's take a closer look. The Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University recently identified a trio of design principles grounded in science that policymakers can use to improve outcomes for children and families across a variety of domains, including, you guessed it, education. The principles are 1, to support responsive relationships for children and adults, 2, to strengthen core life skills, and 3, to reduce sources of stress in the lives of children and families. According to the Center, these principles are interconnected and reinforcing, as progress on any of the 3 makes progress on the others more likely. But conversely, significant challenges in any of these areas can lead to problems in the others. Now, I know what you're probably saying to yourselves. Wait, didn't we already touch on 2 of those principles? You're absolutely right. Both providing supportive, responsive relationships and strengthening core life skills came up in our discussion of protective factors. And they also came up in the context of exploring the negative effects of punitive discipline practices, where we learned that too many children are being deprived of these resilience-building protective factors. This tells us that the punitive approach to discipline is counterproductive. Moreover, it is harmful. It shouldn't be this way for our children, and thankfully it doesn't need to be. Restorative justice practices and social and emotional learning are 2 examples of supportive alternatives to punitive discipline practices that emphasize healthy development of the whole child. They positively reinforce each of the 3 design principles to cultivate healthier school environments, empower students, remove barriers to educational attainment, and equip students with the skills to thrive in and outside of the classroom. Let's take a closer look and apply each design principle to these supportive alternatives to flesh out this idea further. The first design principle is to support responsive relationships. Studies of restorative justice practices in schools have found that it fosters healthy relationships in schools built on a foundation of trust, respect, and care, and it increases engagement for students and families and improves two-way communication, both of which are key to healthy relationships. And studies of social and emotional learning have found that it leads to schools that are characterized by a supportive culture and climate, positive relationships, deeper learning, and improved classroom management. The second principle is to strengthen core life skills. So how do restorative justice practices in schools align with this principle? Well, by replacing fear and punishment as motivators with belonging, connectedness, and a willingness to change, and by creating a school climate conducive to the development of social and emotional skills, one that is also characterized by understanding. As for social and emotional learning, well, the alignment is buried in the name. This supportive alternative fosters core life skills such as self-regulation, executive function, self-efficacy, and empathy, among others. Finally, the third design principle is to reduce sources of stress in the lives of children and families. We mentioned that exclusionary discipline practices are a source of stress for children and families. Studies of restorative justice practices have found that it can reduce suspension rates across the school district, and it can contribute to the narrowing of the racial discipline gap. Here in Washington, the two racial or ethnic groups most overrepresented in school discipline disparities data are American Indian and Alaskan Native students and Black students. Unfortunately, the reality we discussed earlier, that across the country, children with a greater likelihood of exposure to ACEs are also being pushed out of the classroom at a disproportionate rate, rings true here in Washington. American Indian and Alaskan Natives in Washington, for example, who are being pushed out at disproportionate rates, also have the highest prevalence rate of experiencing 3 or more ACEs. Thus, the narrowing of the racial discipline gap is critical to greater equity in children's healthy development and educational success. A failure to address this gap means that our schools will continue to remove from the classroom those children who would otherwise most benefit from the mitigating effects of protective factors promoted in a school environment that implements positive discipline practices. Social and emotional learning as a supportive alternative can also shift race and gender disparities in school discipline, and it has been linked to reduced risk-taking and emotional distress. I know that's a lot that we've packed into the session thus far, so to recap, I want to flag the following key takeaways. 1, punitive discipline practices exacerbate the effects of ACEs and toxic stress. 2, students at a greater risk of experiencing one or more ACEs are being pushed out of schools at a disproportionate rate, both across the country and here in Washington, raising health and education equity concerns. And 3, there is, however, growing momentum around an alternative vision for schools, one grounded in science, that mitigates the effects of ACEs and toxic stress and supports students to reach their full health and academic potential. Earlier this year, ChangeLab Solutions released an issue brief that explores the connections between racial disparities and punitive school discipline practices, the prevalence of ACEs, and children's healthy development and educational success. Nearly all of the studies and research that inform this webinar can be found in the brief, and so we encourage you to check out this resource to learn more. And now I have the pleasure of welcoming Kurt Hatch from the Association of Washington School Principals, who will spend the next 10 to 15 minutes or so providing us with a closer look at another supportive discipline approach, PBIS, or Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. Kurt, please take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I just want to start by saying real quickly that the objective for this presentation is pretty simple. I'm hoping that I provide some resources or takeaways that'll help your system, if it's a school system or district system, increase the behaviors that promote learning and ultimately recapture some instructional time. And I will talk a little bit about PBIS. I also have some other things to share that have been implemented in some schools that I've been in with some success in terms of increasing behaviors that promote learning and capturing actually hundreds of hours of instructional time. So I hope there's some kind of nuggets here for everyone, or at least it'll confirm some of the things that people are already doing. And I'm happy to consult individually at a later time if people want to know more about some of the details that I've shared, because I'm just going to be hitting the surface for some of the components here. And you'll notice that during this presentation, I really won't talk a lot about what we should get students to do, because changing student behavior is primarily a function of changing adult mindset about student behavior and about changing adult behavior itself. So next slide, I just want to acknowledge that behavior is pretty complex and nuanced. Here I've listed a couple of contexts that behavior can appear in. There's social context that can be wrapped around behavior, and behavior can be influenced by the physical environment that a student or an adult actually could be in, and a variety of influences. State of being really means how that person is feeling, how the student is feeling at the time, the state of mind regarding their mood, and also different situations and the motivation for behavior, and I just want to focus on that a little bit more. All behavior is a means to communicate, and most students are trying to attain something or avoid something with the behavior that they're displaying. And I think trying to keep behavior simple for all of us to understand can kind of take some of the mystery and some of the stress around how to respond to behavior appropriately. And I'd also like to acknowledge that behavior is one of the most challenging things to teach. It's not often that you hear students learning a math problem, like something simple like 2 + 2 = 4, and they don't go home and learn that 2 + 2 actually isn't 4. But if you kind of apply that to behavior, behavior can be very fluid. They can learn different behaviors and have different behaviors reinforced in a variety of settings. And so I think we just have to give ourselves some grace on how we learn how to extinguish behaviors and give each other support. And also, with that support, we can see some really significant reductions in behaviors that don't promote learning. So as a result of implementing the components that I'm going to share with you today at a variety of different schools, and the most recent one in particular, this is some of the data that we captured. And so you can see it's pretty significant, including eliminating the use of suspensions. Some of the results were also data showing enhanced teacher-student relationships, which is critical, and creating a more equitable system, because we had some discipline disparities by race that we were really concerned about. So for this presentation today, I've categorized 5 systems, called them critical components, And when implemented with fidelity and embedded into a district and school culture, can result in the type of data that I just showed on the previous slide. One thing that I'd like to add is that these components, it's really important to implement them as designed, because as we know with all behavior, if we're trying to modify it, consistency and predictability are critical. So I just want to start with component number one. Having a discussion about punishment versus discipline is really important, because part of the work to improve discipline systems really involves changing the adult mindset around what discipline is and its effectiveness versus punishment. And here's just one of my favorite quotes from a colleague. He just wrote that we are in the business of teaching, not punishing students. And this is when we were kind of struggling to come up with some different systems, because our previous system was heavy on punishment and wasn't reflecting the needs of the students, and so we were seeing repeated behaviors. So for example, we as a staff really dug in to understand the difference between punishment and discipline, and we found that there's some very serious psychological impacts that come with punishment, and it's really not an effective teaching tool. So we talked about punishment and defined it for ourselves, and quickly noted that it's not something that we want to use as a teaching tool, because it's arbitrary and it's a really fear-based mechanism to try to get students to comply. It was well intended, but it wasn't as effective as we needed it to be. And we found out that there were some things going on in our students' brain as a result of the punishments that we were using as tools, and it was really activating that fight or flight area of the brain, and that was not helping them learn, and it was actually just extinguishing the behavior for short periods of time. So as we changed our practice, we really had to explore what we were doing in our schools and in our systems that was punishment-based, and we were surprised to find some things that we just thought were more effective than they were, and it just kind of reflected our historical practice. So things like the systems of turning a card from green to yellow to red, we discovered that those were really a fear-based mechanism, because it didn't connect the behaviors to the students' thinking, and they just didn't understand it. So we turned to discipline and tried to understand what that means. So I'll just take a moment for folks to read this. Okay, so we started to search out how we utilize discipline as a teaching tool, and things like restorative justice, PBIS, they all fell within this definition. And so we just decided to go all in, especially after we understood how punishment doesn't work. So what I'm sharing here is links to two different articles for those of you that want to go down this road of changing the adult mindset in your setting around punishment, and why it doesn't work, and what does work. So the second critical component is PBIS, and I'm guessing most folks on this call have heard about it. And so there's an article that I have a link there to. It's called Go All In for PBIS, and it's really just encouraging districts and schools to do that, to go all in for PBIS. What I've learned is that there's some opinions possibly circulating out in the field about PBIS as being just kind of a program rather than a system that changes how we do school. And so I'm hoping that my comments today can help change that mindset around PBIS, because it's important that all Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 components are deeply embedded into the culture. And here's just a list of some of them that I think are critical. One, PBIS in the classroom, the check-in, check-out system, and using the school-wide information system to go all in for PBIS. Third, There's a system that we created together as a staff called W.H.O Patrol, and W.H.O just stands for We Have Options, and essentially it's a way to keep students in class. So also attached, also on this slide is a link to an article called Back to Class, and it describes in some depth the system for keeping students in the classroom rather than having them removed from classroom and sent down to the office. So what we discovered is there's a lot of learning time that is lost when students are sent to the office. We can't really account for their safety because nobody really knows where they are between the classroom and the office. And it prioritized this teacher-student relationship because that's the most important relationship in the school. So there's a message being sent to students when a teacher kicks them out of class, and the message is, I'm not interested in having you stay here. Leaving the classroom is more important than you at this moment, and it severs the teacher-student relationship. So there's a system that we put in place, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more in depth about it for those of you who are interested, but just for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to keep it at the surface level in order to move on, but just know that there are a number of schools and districts that are implementing a system where adults go to the classroom, and then there's a process of how the intervention takes place. And I know, for example, down in W.H.O at Jemtegard Middle School, David Cook, who actually might be on this call, he just presented some of the results of implementing the W.H.O Patrol in his setting, and they're saving up to 700 hours of learning time, recapturing that in his school this year. Okay, the fourth critical component, it's called precision requests. And I put an asterisk next to that because this is a point where we are asking teaching staff to change their practice around how they talk to students whose behaviors escalated, students who are having a difficult time regulating their emotional state, and the precision request may lead to a system called think time. Now, some of you may have heard about think time. It's not new, but it is extremely effective, and it has to be implemented as designed because there's some key questions that are embedded in the think time process that cause students to go into the metacognitive state that we need them to go into in order to think about their behavior, think about the correct behavior, the socially acceptable behavior, and acknowledge that they're ready to exhibit that socially acceptable behavior. So think time can't be skipped, and precision requests really reflect the fact that words matter in our interaction with students who are escalated, and too many words really matters. So as much as we want to try to counsel a child out of a certain outburst, it's not time to use a lot of syllables during that time, and we need to use the same words in every setting, in every classroom, leading up to think time in order to provide that consistency and predictability. And again, this is just an overview of precision requests and think time, and I'm happy to consult more with folks that are interested in implementing this in their setting. And our fifth critical component that we adopted and that we worked on for quite a bit of time was our behavior plans. So what we noticed is that we were getting bogged down in very complicated systems for analyzing behaviors and creating plans that were far too complicated. So we started simple with trying to understand the function of students' behavior with regard to, are they trying to attain something? Are they trying to avoid something? We did some analysis around the time and the place that the behavior was occurring in the settings. And then we made sure that the student was completely clear, and this is from kindergarten to first grade on up, that the student was so clear about how the behavior plan was supposed to work that that student could teach it to another student. Because what we realized is that the students weren't understanding how the game was supposed to work, how the behavior plan was supposed to work, how they earned something that they were motivated to earn, and at what point they were not going to earn that, which goes back to the precision requests and the use of think time. In addition, we made sure that the plan was clear, concise, and predictable to all the adults who were involved with this student's life. What we found is from one setting to the next, whether the child was going from music, band, trigonometry to social studies into another setting, including the playground or PE, if all the adults who interacted with that child understood how the behavior plan worked, they could implement it with precision and predictability, then the chance that we would get the desired results, that the behavior, the maladaptive behavior was extinguished and replaced by socially acceptable behavior, it increased by about 95%. Okay. So just to kind of bring us back to where we started, I want us to all have confidence that there, as complicated as behavior can seem, or as intimidating, or it might trigger adult response and emotions, we know that there are proven best ways to promote learning and, increase behaviors that promote learning and extinguish maladaptive behaviors. And one of the things that I would like for everyone to just consider, kind of coming back to the notion of suspension and exclusion from schools, one of the things that we also kept in mind as whenever we were removing a student from a classroom or removing the student for a short-term suspension, we realized that it was a form of ostracism or shunning. And that has a profound psychological impact on the minds of students and adults for that matter. And we were concerned that we were actually creating or contributing to ACEs in our students by ostracizing them. Because every student needs a sense of belonging and a positive relationship with teachers. So for that reason alone, we knew we had to come up with a different system to help students modify their behavior. So as I mentioned at the onset of this presentation, showing the critical components, it's important to give ourselves some grace and understanding that extinguishing maladaptive behaviors and replacing them with socially acceptable behaviors, it can really take time. However, what we came to find is that the vast majority of behaviors can be augmented. And for example, at a previous school, along with the staff who relentlessly loved the 800 students in a very complex setting, we were able to recapture hundreds and sometimes thousands of hours of instructional time, bring a sense of calm to the building, and deepen the student and teacher relationships, and ultimately eliminate the use of suspensions because we did two things. We deeply embedded PBIS into the culture. There's no such thing as PBIS light. And we focused on the proven best ways to increase behaviors that promote learning, and we lived by this following quote by Dr. Ron Edmonds, that we can, whenever and wherever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to do this. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. What's, I think, especially promising about the PBIS approaches and strategy that Kurt talked about, and also the positive approaches that Cesar mentioned, is that they are now becoming institutionalized and supported, and in some cases funded by federal and state policy. Before we talk about how Washington's new school discipline policies promote positive and restorative approaches, I want to just provide some quick context on how Washington's approach connects to the broader national landscape, just by providing a quick overview of some of the reforms taking place in other states and at the federal level. So at the federal level, there are several important pieces of legislation that support states and school communities in creating safe and supportive school environments including the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which safeguards children with disabilities from disciplinary removals, and Title IV and VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits schools from discriminating on the basis of race when imposing disciplinary actions. However, the one I want to highlight today is the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA for short, which replaced No Child Left Behind and governs federal K-12 education policy. At a high level, ESSA is important for a couple reasons. First, it aims to ensure equity for traditionally underserved students. And second, it provides federal funds to help states and school districts meet their needs. And I'm not going to run through all of the provisions here on the slide, but the one I did want to note is that ESSA requires educational plans from each state and school district to describe how they will support efforts to reduce the overuse of exclusionary discipline practices. Additionally, as some of you may know, last December, the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice rescinded the federal school discipline guidance package, which was an important step towards encouraging schools to reduce the disproportionate rates that children of color and children with disabilities are suspended and expelled from classrooms across the country. This was a cause for concern for a lot of education, civil rights, disability rights, and racial justice advocates. However, it importantly did not change any of the federal laws previously mentioned. And in addition, states have a tremendous opportunity now to ensure that state and district level policies allow all children the opportunity to reach their full academic and health potential. And in fact, at the state level, we're actually seeing a lot of momentum there. For example, some recent trends in state level policy show that many states are moving away from zero tolerance policies. Some now limit exclusionary discipline for certain grade levels, usually the youngest grades. Several states prohibit exclusionary discipline for more minor offenses, such as attendance or truancy. And a majority of states, approximately 30 and the District of Columbia, encourage districts and schools to use alternative discipline strategies. And 22 of those states actually name the specific interventions. So these are just a few examples of how states are addressing this issue, but certainly it's not an exhaustive list. Some states also don't allow exclusionary discipline for a first offense or have length restrictions for how long a child can be excluded from school. And several states now include explicit reporting requirements that are consistent with ESSA. And Washington is among the states doing really innovative policy work in this space. As many of you know, OSPI adopted new rules regarding discipline in schools, some of which already went into effect this school year, and the rest will be implemented next school year. I'm not going to get too far into the details of the rules today, but I did want to highlight 4 important elements that are now part of Washington's discipline rules. So first, they provide additional student protections to minimize the use of suspensions and expulsions, except for when there is a threat to student or school safety. They also prohibit expulsions for Washington's youngest learners, so students in kindergarten through 4th grade. Second, they provide more ways for parents and families to engage, not only as it relates to the behavior of their own children, but also in setting school behavior expectations and appropriate school discipline practices. And by state law, school districts have to consult with students, families, and the community when developing and updating district policies. Third, the new discipline rules emphasize the use of research-based best practices. So starting next school year, school districts must first attempt one or more other forms of discipline to support the student in meeting behavioral expectations before suspending them. And this includes both short-term and in-school suspensions. For long-term suspensions and expulsions, the school district has to at least consider an alternative form of discipline. And finally, state law requires that when a school district suspends or expels a student, the student must be afforded the opportunity to receive educational services. That is, they must be allowed to continue participating in general education curriculum. And for more information on what the new rules require and for some really helpful resources, OSPI has several tools and as well as resources to help you navigate some of these new requirements, and we'll name a few of those at the end of the presentation. So the new school discipline rules are really a monumental step towards moving away from zero tolerance discipline practices that exclude children from classrooms for nonviolent behaviors and instead requires schools to take a prevention-based approach, meaning encouraging schools to address the root causes of behavior before it requires discipline. Washington has a unique opportunity to be a leader in this space by using the emerging research on the connections between school discipline and health that we talked about today to really inform policy, practices, and the prioritization of investments in children across the states. Now we wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about a few concerns that we've heard from folks in other states, as well as some of the questions raised by some of you in your responses to the registration questions prior to the webinar. And I also want to remind you to type any questions you might have that haven't been addressed so far into the chat box. Thanks to those who have done so already, because we've saved a bit of time at the end for some Q&A.
One question that often comes up is, without punitive discipline, how do children learn about the importance of consequences? Coloring this question is a concern that without traditional forms of punitive discipline, children will not learn the importance of consequences, without which one may not see the desired changes in behavior. The reality is that although punitive discipline practices expose children to harsh consequences, we don't necessarily see the changes in classroom behavior that many expect to come from these practices. There is an assumption that in order to learn about and from consequences, they must be harsh. However, as Kurt discussed earlier, and also the research that's out there does not support the theory that students who are punitively disciplined will be less likely to engage in problem behavior in the future. Rather, school suspensions in general appear to predict higher future rates of suspensions and misbehavior among those suspended. For example, an evaluation of the use of suspensions in 1,840 middle schools across the country found that suspensions early in the school year were not an effective deterrent to future problem behavior. Punitive discipline practices approach the issue differently, in part by focusing on improving student behavior through the teaching of critical social and life skills, and the research supports this alternative approach. Multiple studies of the implementation of restorative justice practices in schools, for example, have found that not only does it decrease office referrals, suspensions, and expulsions, but it also improves classroom behavior and lowers rates of misbehavior and incidents. Further, restorative justice practices research has confirmed outcomes of improved school climate and safety, positive peer relationships, increased school connectedness, increased accountability and autonomy, and improved academic performance. And studies from preschool to high school have shown that the development of social and emotional skills predict improved social behaviors, engagement, and academic outcomes, as well as lower behavioral problems and psychological distress.
Another question we often hear is, this all sounds great, or I'm already a supporter of positive discipline approaches, but how do I get buy-in for school-wide change? And of course, there are many hurdles when it comes to implementing systemic change at any level. In the context of school discipline, we've heard and seen the following. Many schools are under-resourced and lack the funding and resources to provide adequate professional development and trainings for staff. We already ask educators to do so much, and this can feel like one more thing to their already full plates. It can be difficult to change the perception and practices of staff who are accustomed to using traditional forms of discipline. And some teachers and staff might not recognize their implicit biases and might get defensive when talking about disparities in student discipline data. Whatever the reason might be, a common concern is around the implementation piece and getting successful buy-in from and adequate support for both teachers and administrators. The good news is that if you're an advocate for positive school discipline practices, the evidence is in your favor. You can use the research that we've talked about today to make the case that traditional forms of punishment do more harm than good, and really should be replaced with practices that have a proven track record of success, not only in promoting better behavioral outcomes, but also in improving all of the traditional measures of success that schools care about, including increased attendance, better grades, higher test scores, improved graduation rates, success in college and beyond, and overall well-being. The other argument in your favor is money. This is particularly useful if you're needing to make the case to your school board or superintendent that it actually makes more sense financially to implement positive approaches. Studies show that positive discipline practices have a substantial return on investment. For example, preliminary findings from a study assessing the cost of PBIS found that for every $1 invested in school-wide PBS, it resulted in a fiscal savings of $104.90 solely from reducing dropout by way of reducing suspensions. Similarly, a 2015 study by researchers at Columbia University found that for every $1 spent on social and emotional learning programming, there is an $11 return on investments in long-term benefits, accounting for lifetime earnings, mental and physical health, and juvenile crime. The last thing I want to mention here is just the importance of providing the necessary supports for staff. Being a teacher or school administrator, as I'm sure many of you can relate to on this call, is a lot of work, and it's hard work. It's important that school staff is supported through ongoing professional learning and staff wellness initiatives. This topic in and of itself could be its own webinar, but for sake of time, I will just mention that there are opportunities at both the federal and state levels to blend and braid funding that supports school-wide efforts to create supportive spaces, not only for students, but for staff as well. And I actually encourage you to check out, OSPI has a resource that we'll mention again at the end of the webinar on this very topic.
Of course, we also get lots of questions along the following lines. But wait, what about school safety? It's a fair question and one at the top of many of our minds. The underlying concern here is that the traditional forms of punitive discipline are necessary to keep schools safe for all students and staff. However, punitive discipline practices in schools have been shown to make students feel more isolated and unsafe. These practices are also linked to worsened levels of school connectedness and ratings of school climate. Moreover, and Alexis touched on this earlier, the vast majority of these punitive practices are applied to subjective, non-threatening, and developmentally appropriate offenses rather than those usually associated with school safety, such as violent behavior or bringing a firearm to school. And I should mention that federally required expulsions under the Gun-Free Schools Act for firearms violations are still fully enforced under the new Washington discipline rules. Firearms in schools, after all, are an obvious threat to safety. Alternatively, positive discipline practices can be utilized to help build school connectedness, which is a critical factor in promoting school safety. A study of student and teacher safety in Chicago public schools found that it is the quality of relationships between staff and students and between staff and parents that most strongly define safe schools. Punitive discipline practices undermine these qualities, whereas positive discipline practices center them. The National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, in its final report that it released earlier this year, echoed similar sentiments. Quote, while not a standalone solution, ensuring that young people feel they belong and are emotionally and physically safe in schools can serve as a critical and primary prevention strategy against school violence, unquote. The Commission also cited in its report a review of more than 206 studies finding that the more supportive school climate, the less bullying and other violent and aggressive behaviors occur in schools.
And finally, a question we always hope to hear is, where can I go to learn more? And for that, again, OSPI has a ton of great resources, particularly on the new school discipline rules, also on the funding and financing piece I mentioned earlier, as well as on multi-tiered systems of support and the behavior menu of best practices and strategies. The school discipline issue brief that Cesar mentioned earlier also has a pretty comprehensive appendix, which you can see on the slide, and that offers more information and resources on all of the topics and information that we've cited today. We also recommend checking out a few other resources that we've included here on the slide deck. And then also, we at Change Lab Solutions provide technical assistance, so please don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, we have a few more minutes. I wanted to introduce Mark McKechnie, Senior Consultant, Equity and Student Discipline at the Center for Improvement of Student Learning at OSPI, and Deb Drandoff, Director of Prevention and Youth Services with Educational Service District 112, who have graciously agreed to step in and answer some of the questions as well that have been raised today. So with that, let's just jump into some of the questions. All right, so one of the questions that we got, actually, I'm hoping to ask you, Deb, is around the options for positive discipline related to drug alcohol use, either in addition to or in lieu of suspension. I was wondering if you could share any best practices that you have come across.
Sure, thanks. I think when we're looking at substance use, and I know vaping has come up quite a bit, that we really want to go back to what Cesar mentioned, is looking at the root causes of those behaviors. And we know that so many of our youth who are vaping, using drugs and alcohol, have underlying adverse childhood experiences, mental health issues, depression. And so we really want to see that every youth that is being disciplined around substance use issues is getting screened for what kind of supports that they're going to need. And that's in the forefront. And then, again, minimizing their time out of the building. Often, again, our data shows that these are the youth who are also struggling in school academically, and really recommend that we not be removing them from the class as long as they're working with us. So the number one recommendation we have is to work with your partners, your substance use and mental health partners in your community, and make sure that every one of these youth is getting screened for what's the root cause behind that behavior.
Thank you. We've also received a couple questions around family engagement, including best practices for engaging families and providing them with the support they need to be effective partners. So I was wondering if maybe Cesar, you could take that question first, and then Kurt, if you have any additional insights.
Sure. Thanks, Alexis. So I think, when we talk about supportive relationships, one of the most supportive relationships that a child can benefit from is the supportive relationships that they find in their home, in addition to those in the school. So when we're talking about some of these critical life skills, whether it's social and emotional or other skills that we want to promote in schools via these positive alternatives, these are also skills that are important to promote in the home and family setting. And oftentimes we see key community partners that work with families, or sometimes even local government agencies, also taking a proactive approach to train parents, caregivers, and other folks up on some of these skills that are necessary to support children in their efforts to overcome their exposure to ACEs and toxic stress. Beyond that, I think family engagement is critical to the success of any school policy change. It's certainly a topic that can be addressed in its own webinar altogether, but I think it's important, I'll quickly mention, to proactively engage those family members who are traditionally left out of some of the outreach processes, and that includes efforts to promote events or host events in different languages, hosting them at times when family members could actually attend them, so not always necessarily during the school day, but in the evenings, and also doing things like providing child care support or food. These are all sort of best practice activities that can be done to make sure that you get a larger turnout for events that involve family engagement.
And this is Kurt. I'll just add, sure, yeah, I'll add one other thought, and it's really the power behind the questions that we ask of our families. And are we asking questions that allow us to learn more, or are we trying to teach them more about school and how school functions? So, for example, is doing home visits, where the goal of that home visit is to build a relationship, build some trust, and doing so through a learning stance, and asking parents what's important for us to know about your child, what are you proud of about your child, how can we help your child in ways that make most sense to you and your family. And those conversations can happen in the home, in a neutral setting, or also in the school setting.
Thank you. So I just want to be mindful of time with a minute left. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all the questions, but we'll be following up with each of you individually after to make sure you get your questions answered. But I do want to thank Kurt Hatch again for joining us, as well as Mark McKechnie and Dave Drandoff for helping make this webinar possible. And thank you all for participating. Please feel free to get in touch and share your questions or comments with us. As soon as this webinar ends, you'll be directed to a very quick follow-up survey, so please just take a quick minute or two to share your feedback with us and help shape this continuing conversation. And after this presentation, you'll also receive a link for the recording of the webinar, as well as the PDF of all the slides with links to all the resources that we talked about today. So with that, I want to thank you all again and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.